So I'm Ben Savage. I'm the CEO of Veritas Automata. So I'm going to be talking about DevOps, and probably this will be the least technical presentation of the day, but I do have some fun stuff in it. We'll get to my official bio. So if you thought I was the actor, I apologize. I am not the actor. I actually had the name before him. For all of those who demoed earlier, I do apologize. I break everyone's demos. I've actually blown boards and generated smoke in front of customers. As one of my friends reminded me today that anything can be a smoke machine as if you operate it wrong enough. And that tends to be the world I come from. Let me, there we go. Cool. So, but the big thing I've been doing is I've been doing IoT systems. The first time I was sitting here thinking about the session this morning, the panel, which hit very close to home, I realized the first time I did an IoT system, I won't describe how old I was, but Windows 95 wasn't a thing yet. What I will say is that we were using 485 and modems to go do it. So the world has come a long way since then. But everything that group talked about as they were going through, if you have not done IoT before, are things to think about. Particularly remember that most IoT systems are not that intelligent. I was talking with Ale later, and when we think in the world now about a small node having 4 gigs of memory or something like that, there are still a lot of IoT systems out there in the world that might have a meg of memory. And so when you think about what that means for your resources and how you go deal with that, it's a big difference in how you go build your system and how you engineer it. So it's one thing to come from the cloud and realize we have all these resources, but once you get on the edge, you don't. So that's kind of my background and some of what I've done. I'm going to start with some definitions because I'm going to talk about machine learning. I'm going to talk about Gen AI. I realize most of the people in the room probably know the difference between them, but the number of times I've been in conversations in the last year alone where people treat them both as the same and they treat AI as something new versus something that's already been there. So first, I'm going to talk about machine learning. This is something that we've all used every day. So anyone who's using some kind of metrics-based system where it's got intelligent alerting, you're using machine learning. But what you're going to find, and this is the executive speaking again, you're going to find now more and more of your customers are going to say, what is your AI strategy? What is your AI policy? And they're going to ask you to justify and explain in detail what those algorithms are. I just had that come from a major customer of ours because they've all realized now that this Gen AI, where that data that before they didn't care so long as they got those alerts, they got those fraud alerts, they got the notifications of whatever they were. They didn't really care that much before as long as they got valuable information from it. Now they're all realizing that with Gen AI and the use of data training, and now this new scary thing when you get to Gen AI about hallucinations, people want to understand where it is and what it is. So don't be surprised if your leadership team and managers start asking you, okay, what models are we using? How are we using them? And how do we know they're going to behave the way they're expected to, that they're not going to hallucinate? Because right now people are not differentiating between conventional machine learning we've been doing for decades and this new Gen AI thing. And the biggest way I look at the difference is most conventional machine learning is deterministic. I can feed in a specific set of data, I can feed in that specific algorithm, and I get a repeatable, consistent result every time I run it. Gen AI, I can't do that. And so Gen AI is where we're starting to talk about the GPTs, the generative pre-trained transformers, large language models, image diffusion. And some of these techniques are starting to get combined, by the way. I don't know if anybody saw, there was a new announcement 2-3 days ago about a new group, and I'm going to blank on their name, but they're using a diffusion-based technique, which is normally used for image generation, for token generation for large language models. Really, really cool in how fast it speeds up the generation, but it's a different approach. And it's different than what everyone's seen. So the question is, how does that modify the accuracy and the rest of it? So that'll be really cool to go play with. My team and I like to really experiment with these things too when we're not doing it with the day-to-day. Oh, sorry. This is the boring slide. This is one where we're talking about, okay, so when everyone first started using this, they started using ChatGPT. People were posting whole business documents into it. Nobody was reading the terms of service. If you don't have a subscription to those accounts, how is your data being used? Is it being used to train the model? Is it being used to train just the responses? So some of those early ones, they were saying, you own the data you submit, but they own the response back. What does that mean? If you get a very specific to your business question responses from that model, they're now using that to go train. So your data has now left your ecosystem. So you've got to think about how are you going to protect your business's data as you use this with the models. And you can get around this by using a subscription, by going to their APIs. The other thing you've got to think about is how do these models change over time? If I can't control when this is deployed and they go deploy a new enhancement, does that break all the prompts and everything I've just posted or been using to build my system? Open source has some different problems, right? You're going to have to run this on bare metal, or you're going to have to run this in a cloud instance that you control. You're going to have to deploy it. You're going to have to put all the infrastructure out. Still very, very useful, but different tools. So you've got to understand those as you go through them. I think some of this stuff is some of the coolest stuff that we're going to do as we go forward. It just provides some really creative approaches you can go do. But you got to understand what you're doing and how you're going to use it. I'm going to digress here a little bit because I've got a very creative team. I think we've all been in those meetings where they've been going on for about 2 hours too long. And you're now in there and a discussion takes a sidebar and you go, okay, what would happen? So my team is distributed from Toronto down to Southern Argentina. And a couple of my folks do raise chickens. And we were in a meeting and someone wasn't on mute and their chickens were making a racket. This led to a whole side conversation. And a lot of us are also music fans. And so somehow the phrase chicken smugglers got brought up. And then all of a sudden, because we've got a number of people fairly near Kentucky, it became the Colonel and the Chicken Smugglers. And before we knew it, we had a virtual band. And you can see we've got a picture for the virtual band. And we've got the ability to generate the lyrics with the ChatGPT. And when we first started doing this in 2023, music generation was, we'll just call it okay. This is what it could do.
Woke up this morning, sunlight's going in the heartland with a...
So, okay, that's okay. It's what happens if maybe we play with tech a little too much. But this is what happened when I did it a year later. And it's actually progressed a lot further since then. If it plays.
Woke up this morning, sunlight's shining, and now I land with roses.
So it's come a long way in a very short period of time on what it can do. And this is only a 30-second one. I have a couple of full songs in other versions. But no, the key thing is it's come a long way. And like if you listen to Spotify, you're going to hear AI generated music, whether you are looking for it or not. It's there, it's out there. If you're not paying attention, it's at least okay. Some of it's better than a lot of bands I've paid to go see too. And now with all this, the next thing is you can do video. So of course, we've built the virtual band, we've created the idea. We have discovered one thing you can't do. They do not actually lip sync chicken lips very well. But if you put people on, it does a pretty...
Woke up this morning, sunlight's shining, and now I land with roses I wanted.
And so, by the way, when you're working with AI, there's a whole bunch of different approaches you can take. I tend to take a one-shot approach, i.e. what's the simplest prompt I can do, and what are the results I get, right? So that's one approach. There are ways you can spend a lot more time refining your prompts and refining it that will get much better results than what I can do. But this is what I can do in 5 minutes when I'm in between meetings or on a plane. The key thing is the tech has come a long way, and it's something I think we all need to think about. But this is what we find is a lot of fun as a team. But then the question is, okay, so you can do this once, you can do this with prompts, but how do you really think about something that's going to be scalable and deploy it? So I'm going to jump back into the real world. And I mentioned the case that we were talking about IoT earlier. So this is an example of one of the projects that my team has built for a customer of ours. And we've done a couple of projects for this customer. So if you guys have ever seen the Little Caesars pizza portal, my team did all the engineering for that for the company that built that for Little Caesars. So all the software. So that's a device, if you haven't seen it, that allows you to order online from Little Caesars. You go there when your pizza's ready, you get a notification, you'll scan your phone, the door will open, it keeps the pizza at about 140 degrees. So think about everything that's in one of these robots, but all fixed with the addition of having to keep things at a very specific temperature control. To meet the certification, we had to keep it within, I think, 3 degrees of the desired temperature every time a door opens. If you ever built temperature control PID loops, not as easy as it seems, not as fun as it seems, but more fun than working with load cells. That's a different story for a different day. This particular project, we were helping them with another solution, and they needed to do in-compartment detection where we could rapidly change how that algorithm worked. We could update it for new items, new things that went in. So we ended up using a camera. So each of these devices we deploy in the field, and we've got thousands of them deployed, have between 3 and 32 different compartments. Each has a single camera in each compartment. So you start to scale that up, right? You're at 32,000 cameras before you know it. Okay, so now we've got all these devices out there. We've got to manage the OS, we've got to manage the application, and we've got to manage the machine learning model. So this is where we come to DevOps, Kubernetes, and this is where you were talking about GitOps. It's very familiar to us as we're doing this for all the stuff out in the field. And we run this a little differently than most people. A lot of times when you see a edge server type application, you have the devices that are communicating via a simple protocol to the cloud. Well, we decided to take a little bit different approach that is more complicated, which is the edge is actually part of the cloud cluster. So when we've got all these devices out in the field, they're actually part of the same cluster with the cloud, which we're actually hosting in AWS for this particular customer. And then we're continuously pushing updates out for the application. So we're using Fleet, Flux to go do that. So we can go distribute new application levels, and we can do new models out to the edge. And I won't lie that sometimes we've had a couple of hair-losing situations as we had to get everything worked out as we scaled this particular solution. But this is one approach that we've built. But you can't do this for tens and thousands of devices without using DevOps, right? Everything has to be, whether it's a Helm chart or a Terraform script, it's got to be automated so you can go deploy it out. And this is where I come in as a leader and have to remind people, when leaders are hearing things, as managers and operators of businesses are hearing things, they go, why do I need to go spend all this time building the infrastructure to do the deployment, the CI/CD pipeline? Not the cool application I want to go sell, not the customer facing piece, but the DevOps piece of this, the SRE piece of this, because that's what makes it so I can go deploy this consistently, I can scale the business, and I can support those existing customers. This is a different use case, because I kind of started talking about Gen AI and everything with that. This is when we were talking with a customer. They were in, I'll call it a REIT. So that's a real estate investment trust. So they have a ton of documents. So they have all the different lease agreements that are coming in for the different facilities and the different places they manage. And they wanted to use Gen AI so they could, one, query the information, and two, start to generate new things. And so when you think about a useful application to a business like that, okay, so I have thousands of different leases that are out there. They're all going to be coming due over different years, so they're written over different times of the year, or you've got different historic versions. So what version of which legal clause is in what document? So I can quickly find what ones do I have to go update when the new version comes out. So that's kind of what we're helping this customer with. Oh yeah, it was also offline or off cloud and in a Windows environment. So that's always someone's got to add to the difficulty, right? It's never just enough to have one challenge. So as we looked at that, we started looking at the Kubeflow ecosystem. There were some problems because they wanted to run it all with Windows, but we still thought that the Kubeflow portion of the Kubernetes ecosystem was going to be the best way to distribute that model. So as a leader, I think it's really important to start to, and a leader and a manager and as a officer in a startup, how do you start to balance the cost of what you're doing, and how do you look at what the impacts are of the systems? And what do I mean by that? So how do I make sure I have the teams with sufficient tooling that we are, one, being able to automate our deployment and our scale up and our scale down of resources, right? Because it's really easy for teams to say, I'm going to throw a bigger hammer at it. I'm going to throw a bigger instance at it. I'm going to throw a bigger instance at it. But do you really need that bigger instance all the time? Or is it only for little peaks, right? Is it something you can go use spot instances and then you can have use your Kubernetes expertise to go turn up what you're using from a resource and then go turn them down when you're not using it with sufficient automation. The other thing is, how are you building in all of your testing so that you know that the system is going to, when you deploy a new version or when you start to make changes in your infrastructure, or if someone decides to unleash a little chaos in it, that the system is going to continue to function as it's supposed to without throwing hours and hours of manual testing, right? That's always easy because when you start to do the automation, and this is when as a leader, you start to go, okay, I can spend 25% of my sprint towards automation, or I can spend 10% to manual testing and get another customer feature in. That's a hard choice sometimes, but it's one that you do have to look at, because when you think about scaling, if you don't have that automation in, that 10% creeps up to 20% to 30%, and all of a sudden you're spending 4 weeks in dev and 4 weeks doing manual testing because it's manual. It's not automated. The developers aren't able to push it through. And even then, lots and lots of bugs and other issues are coming out. So that's all things that to think about. And then these are things that you can build business cases if you're a developer or a team lead to say, hey, if we do this, we can save X number of hours and X amount of time and improve quality. And it might be a challenge to find exactly when you do that, but most business leaders will accept that's why we have to go do it. And that's super, super important for everyone to understand, right? It's not just how do we work harder, it's how do we work smarter with all of this. I'm getting just so I can see my slide here. So, we were talking about automated testing. I think one of the other things that people don't do enough sometimes is they don't practice their run books. So everyone says they have a run book and you run it and then there's a problem. Okay, then you go pull the run book out. But you can make deployments much smoother if the team does practice. Some of this is where we talk about some of the chaos engineering where they're just getting unintentional drills as they go through because that triggers. But some of it you can do where you take the DevOps team and say, hey, we've got a major deployment coming up in a week or in 2 weeks. Let's go run it in dev, or let's run it in one of the test environments and make sure that all of our run books work the way they're supposed to. And I bet if you don't do that, or even when you do, you will find that there's something that someone didn't write because they just assumed everyone else knew how to do that particular step, or a piece of technology has evolved and there's a newer version of the library and the command is slightly changed. And if you don't have that, when you're trying to do that deployment at 3 a.m., when you're trying to do that deployment at 3 a.m., that's the pieces you're going to miss. And that's the piece that's going to hang the team up for a while. So that's my lightning talk. And I'm glad to answer questions and speak about this from a business leader who spends a lot of time asking his team, why don't we have the automation we're looking for? Or why are we taking so long to get the testing and the automation to the next phase?
All right. Any questions? Should we put some of the colonel of the chickens in the background while we get the questions running?
There was a whole brief experiment with Yacht Rock and can you summarize corporate annual reports in it? Those songs are a little longer, but not quite as energetic.
Right.
So one of the things I always think about is when you have a huge amount of Gen AI generating everything from audio, video, stories, and things like that, what exactly is the truth anymore? And how do you even, to say where's the provenance of where this was generated from? Did it come from a human mind? And it could even be a human mind that was lying, but is it the machine's lying? Is it an inherent lie? Is it really the truth? And where do you stand? Where do you see us going in the future with all the things that are being generated?
So I'll answer that in a couple of different ways. I think that there is a big question of how do you call it watermark or other things, Gen AI created content just in the broader ecosystem, right? How do you create that validation? Because there's so many of these tools and there are so many that are so good. And what most people are thinking about are the ones that you go to a service to go do. The ones I'm both terrified and excited about are the ones I can run on my local machine. So on this machine, I've got a little bit of an Olama addiction. So I think I've got about 30 different models in here I can run and ask different questions from a text-based perspective. those will always be there. I can always run those. There are no guardrails around those on what I can either ask it to do or what I can ask it or what it will generate. And I think that's one of the things, if it's in a solution that's provided as a service to somebody, there are some guardrails generally in there. There are some limits, but to your point, right? There was a case with Synthesia, which is a French avatar company that got caught. People were abusing it in Venezuela, and I'm going to forget the other country, but they were creating PR campaigns that were basically political propaganda using them. That's going to be really hard to go tell what it is, particularly if it's running on some local and there is no watermark, there is no distinguishing thing. So I think that is a very real danger. I don't have an answer on how to stop it, but what I can say is if you're building applications using it, you have to think about that. You have to think about what are the guardrails, what are appropriate responses or appropriate ways to go do it. When do you put a watermark or some way to go do it? Or like in a lot of the solutions we build around text, we're really less focused on trying to generate using the model itself when we're tying in with someone's data. We're using a retrieval augmented generation or something like that. And then it's very important for us to say, we found this particular piece of information in this document. This is why we believe this is a true fact. And then if you start to go generate content from it, you can say, these are the templates or the subject pieces we used. I think in the broader world, it's going to be an interesting couple of years. I wish I had a better answer on that.
Follow-up question kind of along the lines. Since you're like, seems like you're in that space more, are there conversations around like AI ethics happening, or is everything just kind of like rushed to get to the next product? Or
I think it's all of the above, right? And just look at whatever happened with OpenAI over the last 2 years, right? A lot of that was about AI ethics, right? I'm not as concerned about, artificial general intelligence and them becoming alive. So if you work with these enough, you realize that it's still an algorithm. It still responds in certain ways. It's not thinking. It's just coming up with different probabilities than we might as normal people. But I think there are a lot of questions that should be asked about how are these being used? What are appropriate answers? Like we've been doing some stuff in the life science space. Okay, so what are appropriate guardrails to put on that solution as we build it? Because I may be able to ask it to go summarize a cancer study as a summary. I probably shouldn't be able to get it to tell me the lyrics to a rock song. And that, it's just not the right way to go handle patient data. And so that's, I think, something that needs to be thought about whenever you're using these tools, even if you're using conventional machine learning, quite frankly. It's what is the data set I'm using? What are the potential biases? What are the ways I can make sure it's being accurate in what it's doing? And then, and that's the hard part of what we do, right?
Any other questions? What's your take on DeepSeek?
So I think it's interesting because I think what they may have figured out, and I think everyone's still trying to really get to the bottom of what they did, is if they figured a way to be more efficient in their training than the other models, that's really, really cool. Now, everyone was really worried about it was censoring, and my initial reaction was it wasn't, but I remembered something. I was running it on my local computer. So I was asking about Tiananmen Square, and it was answering my questions. I'm like, it's not doing anything funny here. But then I realized that most people were asking it to the hosted version of DeepSeek, different guardrails, different system prompts. The system prompt changes how an LLM responds in a massive way. So that's one thing to think about. I think the other thing is that some of the things that people were worried about DeepSeek not answering, if you ask Llama, it wouldn't answer the same questions. So I think the thing it made me think about as much as anything is, one, I still need to really understand how they figured out how to do their training, because that could be a very cool cost breakthrough. But we've all got to understand these tools a little more. It's not just sending a prompt into a solution. It's what are the system prompts? What are the other guardrails? Because that's going to affect the answers it gives back. And let's say I'm doing some kind of chemical engineering with it. That might trip guardrails that someone has built in for general public safety because they don't want it to teach a bomb. But if I'm working for a defense contractor, maybe that's what I want it to do. But again, right, back to your ethics question. How do I make sure that doesn't get out in the wrong way either? But I think it's interesting. I think honestly, when I run Llama 7DB on this machine versus DeepSeek 7DB, the thinking part is cool, but I'm not sure the performance hit is worth it for at least the use cases I'm using it for. Thank you.